Welcome to Classic Investigator, where each tale unfolds like a cozy chat over a steaming cup of coffee. Today, I present a delightful new mystery starring the ever-observant and wonderfully sharp Miss Marple, the beloved amateur sleuth crafted by Agatha Christie. Settle in, and together let's unravel this charming puzzle. If you'd like, drop a quick comment to share where you're joining from. It's always a joy to connect with our little detective community. Now let's dive into Miss Marple and the poison in the plum cake. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed to leap from a village postcard, with golden sunlight filtering through the yew trees and the air infused with the subtle scents of lavender and freshly cut grass. On the lawn behind the vicarage, tables were set with crisp white cloths, while the ladies of St. Mary Mead glided among them, expertly balancing plates of sandwiches and cups of tea. Laughter rose in gentle bursts, accompanied by the delicate clink of china and the soft rustle of skirts. The annual Garden Society tea was, after all, more than just a social gathering. In a serene setting, rivalries and alliances unfolded, with competitions over roses and dahlia intertwining with hushed critiques of dress hems, scone textures, and the hidden shortcomings of husbands. Miss Marple sat at ease on a folding chair by the rose border, her knitting resting in her lap, though her fingers barely stirred. To the casual observer, she appeared to be just a charming elderly lady savoring her tea and lemon drizzle cake. Yet, those familiar with Miss Marple would have noticed the subtle tilt of her head. Her eyes wandered from table to table, capturing snippets of conversation that danced through the air like dandelion seeds. In St. Mary Mead, gossip transcended mere idle chatter. It was a currency exchanged with meticulous attention. This afternoon, the atmosphere was thick with it. At the heart of the refreshments table, a plum cake stood proudly, its dark surface shimmering under a delicate layer of sugar. Baked by Mrs. Lathbury, a woman renowned for both her flawless pastries and her keen wit, the cake elicited admiration and envy year after year. Other ladies, but today the murmured compliments felt almost obligatory, as though minds were occupied elsewhere. That distraction arrived in the form of a man standing a little apart from the crowd, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. He was dressed in a suit that had seen better days, his shoes a touch scuffed, his expression wary, like a man returning somewhere he was not entirely sure he was welcome. His name, the whispers confirmed, was Mr. Godfrey, a villager's son who had left St. Mary under somewhat unfortunate circumstances more than 20 years ago. Years prior, a dispute had arisen, accompanied by whispers of missing funds, and now he found himself once more at the periphery of the garden gathering, his gaze momentarily fixating on the plum cake. Miss Marple's hands halted over her knitting. Her cake, a seemingly harmless delight, yet in St. Mary, nothing could retain its innocence for long. As the tea continued, the genuine discourse shifted away from dahlia and bonus. The ladies clustered beneath the apple trees, their voices hushed just enough to imply something more beneath the surface. "Did you catch that?" Mrs. Bantry whispered to her neighbor about his return to settle some unfinished business, something regarding the old cottage his aunt left him. "But I heard it wasn't just the cottage he was interested in," her companion remarked, eyes flicking toward Mr. Godfrey, after the way he departed. "And poor Mrs. Lathbury, can you imagine baking for him after everything?" Miss Marple listened intently, her expression serene. It was one of her finest skills to remain unnoticed in the midst of it all. Her own village lay in the background, like delicate lace adorning a tablecloth. People conversed openly around her, often forgetting her presence until it was too late. Amid the murmurs, a narrative began to unfold, a conflict over inheritance, a quarrel that erupted into shouts on the vicarage lawn, leading to a swift exit that raised more questions than it resolved. The plum cake, it appeared, was more than just a village centerpiece. It was a symbol, though whether of reconciliation or something more sinister, Miss Marple could not yet determine. It was all in the smallest of details. That caught her eye was a tiny indentation along the cake's edge where the sugar dusting had been smudged, as though a finger had traced it before the cake was set out. It was hardly remarkable, and yet something about it felt wrong. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tea cooling beside her. Across the lawn, Mrs. Lathbury was accepting compliments on her baking with her usual brisk modesty, but Miss Marple noticed how her gaze flicked repeatedly toward Mr. Godfrey, her smile tight at the edges. And then there was Mr. Godfrey. He had taken a slice of cake, but left it untouched beside his sorcerer when someone suggested he should taste it, a taste of home after all these years. He offered a strange smile, but his fingers drummed nervously against the arm of his chair. Miss Marple had lived long enough to understand that a garden party's cake was usually just cake, but sometimes it represented something entirely different. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where resentments aged like brandy, the return of a prodigal son was seldom a cause for celebration. As the sun descended, casting a warm glow, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement as guests transitioned to the raffle. Miss Marple, with a gentle touch, folded her knitting into her basket, aware that the festivities would soon conclude. The tables would be cleared, and the ladies would return to their husbands and the comfort of their firesides. Yet, beneath the surface, something significant had begun that afternoon, something far removed from mere flowers or baking. With her observant eyes and attentive ears, Miss Marple was determined to uncover the true nature of the plum cake, which had been served with great ceremony, each slice placed on delicate plates alongside cups of strong tea and polite praise for Mrs. Laurie's dependable hand with fruit and pastry. Guests took their portions with varying degrees of enthusiasm, some out of genuine appetite, others out of obligation to village tradition. It was halfway through this ritual of polite consumption that Mrs. Emmeline Hartnell, a woman with a fondness for gossip and a tendency to hover too close to other people's conversations, lifted a forkful of cake to her mouth. She chewed once, then twice, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly. It was an ordinary moment when the cough struck, sharp and unexpected. Her teacup rattled in its saucer, her hand trembling. A second cough followed, harder this time, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Conversation around the table faltered as heads turned in her direction, smiles frozen awkwardly in place. Mrs. Hartell's face had gone quite ashen, her hands scrabbling at her collar. A strained wheeze escaped her lips. Then her body lurched forward, sending her plate clattering to the ground. The plum cake, so proudly presented, lay ruined at her feet. For one terrible moment, no one moved. Then, with a collective intake of breath, the garden erupted into shocked confusion, chairs scraping, voices rising, someone crying out for help. Yet amidst the chaos, one figure remained still. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten in her lap, simply watched. Dr. Hawk, who had fortuitously attended the garden party to judge the cucumber competition, stepped forward without hesitation. With the brisk competence of a man who had seen his fair share of village crises, he knelt beside Mrs. Hartnell's fingers searched for a pulse that was already fading. "Fetch some water," someone suggested pointlessly, though it was clear that no amount of water could reverse what had already taken hold. Miss Marple heard the doctor's low murmur, a word not meant for public ears, but one that floated toward her all the same. Poison. By the time Mrs. Hartell's lifeless form had been gently moved to the shade of the vicarage, the word had rippled through the gathering like an electric current. Poison. Not a heart attack, not a piece of plum. Cake stuck uncomfortably in the throat, yet something far more intentional lingered. Within moments, the conjecture had started. How could this occur? Who could be responsible? And most urgently, what toxin had been employed? Dr. Hawk's somber demeanor addressed that last inquiry before it was voiced. His voice, when it finally emerged, was steady yet unwavering. "Cyanide," he stated softly, without a hint of uncertainty. Miss Marple's hands, which had been resting gently in her lap, tightened just a bit more. There was an unmistakable quality about cyanide. She understood it was not a poison one encountered by chance. It was a deliberate choice, a decision made with intention. The guests, still congregated in tense groups, began to regard one another with a different perspective. There was a fresh fatigue in their gazes, a subtle assessment of opportunity and motive, and inevitably names began to surface, whispered in low tones, yet each laden with the burden of suspicion. Mrs. Lathbury, who had prepared the cake, could it be that she had hidden something within her own masterpiece? It seemed unimaginable, but then again, Mrs. Hartnell. Once, an unkind comment had been made about Mrs. Laurie's sponge cake at a church event years ago. Villagers, after all, had long memories. Then there was Mrs. Bantry, the hostess, whose garden had unwittingly become the scene of this tragedy. Could the poison have originated from her kitchen, slipped into the cake after it left Mrs. Laurie's hands? And of course, there was Mr. Godfrey, the returning stranger. What a convenient way to settle old scores than to poison a village gathering, hidden among faces that had not quite forgiven or forgotten. His hasty departure all those years ago, voices lowered further, weaving motive from whispers, building suspicion like a child assembling a house of cards. Miss Marple, who had heard more village accusations in her lifetime than most policemen encountered in a career, listened without comment. Gossip, she knew, often held a kernel of truth, but only rarely the whole truth. She kept her gaze soft, her smile gentle, and her mind sharper than any knife in Mrs. Laurie's kitchen. While the others whispered and speculated, Miss Marple watched. It was something she had mastered. She had always excelled at observing without drawing attention to herself, at listening without giving the impression of eavesdropping. It was this subtle attentiveness that allowed her to catch the tiniest detail that everyone else overlooked. One of the attendees, a woman not especially familiar with Mrs. Hartnell or Mrs. Lathbury, stood slightly apart from the clustered groups, her cup of tea held gently in her hands. Her expression, like those of the others, bore the expected mask of shock, yet something about it felt off. It lacked the wide-eyed horror typical of sudden tragedy, nor did it carry the furtive guilt often associated with such moments. Someone concealing a truth, yet it was something much more, revealing a brief flicker of relief, so ephemeral it could have been dismissed entirely. But for Miss Marple, it was everything. The woman's hands remained steady, her breath calm, not the response of someone mourning an unexpected loss, but rather of one who had anticipated such an end and now felt a fleeting sense of safety. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the remnants of the plum cake, still scattered beside Mrs. Hartell's toppled chair. A thought began to take shape, not yet a conclusion, merely the faint glimmer of the chance that if the wrong individual had passed, the right one remained very much alive. The following morning after the garden gathering, Miss Marple decided to make a few cordial visits, the kind of calls that would raise no eyebrows. After all, when calamity befalls a community, it is customary for neighbors to wander into each other's sitting rooms, sharing kind words over lukewarm tea and buttered biscuits. At Mrs. Bantry's the dialogue commenced with rhubarb and the dismal weather before gently meandering ever so, with a delicate approach to the plum cake. Mrs. Bantry shook her head in disbelief. "Poor Emmeline," she lamented. "I always said she took far too much sugar, but one hardly expects cake to be perilous." Miss Marple nodded in agreement, her hands resting softly in her lap. "And to think," she added, "it could have been anyone, with all those plates being passed around so freely." Her comment was carefully crafted, leaving just enough room for speculation to flourish. "Between you and me," Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, "I wouldn't be surprised if it's all connected to that. Engaging in business with the Godfrey boy reveals how people cling to their pasts." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild interest, yet her thoughts raced ahead, tracing the thread just presented. In St. Mary, every conversation wove a rich tapestry, and the skill lay in discerning which loose thread to tug. Each visit brought forth new insights. At Mrs. Price Ridley's, discussions revolved around inheritances left unresolved after a family dispute from decades past. Meanwhile, at Miss Weatherb's, the narrative shifted to a romance that had soured, centering on a young woman abandoned at the altar. Her heart was bruised, and her temper had sharpened into something far more resilient. At Colonel Easterbrook's, the atmosphere was even darker. "You know," the colonel remarked, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor. "People forget, but I remember quite clearly. There were rumors about money disappearing, money that was meant for that poor girl. No one seemed able to agree on the precise nature of the scandal, but they all remembered enough to know there had been ugliness, and the names whispered then were the same ones whispered now." Miss Marple never pressed, she never asked. She quietly sat, listened, and occasionally commented on the curious nature of it all, until her hosts had talked themselves into a corner. By the time she departed each house, her knitting bag contained more than just yarn. When she arrived at Mrs. Bartlett's parlor, the conversation had completely shifted focus. No longer was it about the plum cake or the unfortunate Mrs. Hartnell. Now, it revolved around Mr. Timpson, the newcomer who had taken rooms at the old station master's cottage and had kept to himself. The moment he stepped into town, An unsettling silence enveloped him. Trouble seemed to follow him like a shadow, and Mrs. Bartlett, with her eyes sparkling from the thrill of gossip, hinted at his past misdeeds, perhaps forgery or theft, though the details eluded me. The old adage echoed in my mind. Once a thief, always a thief. Miss Marple, with her polite smile, offered no insight, remaining tight-lipped. It was a familiar pattern. The villagers had a knack for zeroing in on the newest face, weaving a web of suspicion as if malevolence could only emerge from fresh arrivals. Outside, she expressed her gratitude to Mrs. Bartlett for the tea, complimented her scones, and continued on her way. Yet, as she strolled down the lane, her mind wandered elsewhere. The villagers' swift certainty regarding Mr. Timpson unsettled Miss Mel. It felt too convenient, too easily accepted. Such convenient suspects posed a danger not to the suspects themselves, who often had no connection to the crime, but to the truth, which could easily evade capture while everyone focused on the wrong individual. Miss Marple had witnessed this scenario a bit too often. In fact, the loudest whispers often drown out the subtle truths, and in this instance, her intuition hinted that the reality was not found in the traces left by an unknown figure, but rather in the meticulously maintained paths of St. Mary. She recalled the cake, the elusive recipe book, and the strange response she had observed at the garden party. It seemed someone had anticipated Ed's demise, but not Mrs. Hartel's. As she strolled home, her hands gently resting on her handbag, Miss Marple's thoughts coalesced around a single, unsettling notion. The wrong individual had perished, while the right one remained very much alive. Much afraid, by mid-morning, Constable Gregg arrived at the vicarage, notebook in hand, and a slightly sheepish expression, as though the very idea of poisoning at a garden party was somehow a personal embarrassment. He stood awkwardly at the tea table, clearing his throat before delivering the news already whispered through every parlor in St. Mary. "Cyanide," he said, almost apologetically. "That's the official word from Dr. Heek." A murmur rippled through the gathered guests, who had returned not out of morbid curiosity, they would say, but to provide clarity. Miss Marple, who was meticulously folding napkins, noticed the nuanced changes in expressions: relief for some, alarm for others. The constable continued, posing the question of who could possibly acquire such an item, something not typically found in a kitchen cupboard. Mrs. Bantry contributed a suggestion regarding rat poison, though Miss Marple observed that she averted her gaze while mentioning it, as if hesitant to associate such a grim matter with her own pantry. Or a chemist, Reverend Clement pondered, considering someone with specialist knowledge. Miss Marple's fingers stilled over the napkin, though she said nothing. Specialist knowledge indeed, a phrase that always meant more than it seemed. As the constable took notes, and the conversation drifted between alarm and speculation, Miss Marple made a quiet inquiry of her own. How precisely had the poison entered the cake? Sprinkled over the top, perhaps? Mrs. Lathbury ventured, though I can't imagine how. But Doctor, who had inspected the remains of the fatal slice, shook his head. "No, it was baked in," he said firmly, folded into the batter itself. There was a pause, one of those moments in village conversations where something significant is recognized all at once, though no one wants to be the first to say it. Then the person who did it, Miss Marple said softly, must have had rather a good understanding of baking, knowing precisely how to add it, without altering the texture or the taste. The women glanced at each other, suspicion flickering behind polite smiles in a village where everyone prided themselves on their victorious sponges and ginger loaves. The ability to baking was not uncommon, but to infuse it with poison was an entirely different matter. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the table where the cake had once been, and a troubling yet strangely familiar thought began to take shape. It was a subtle detail, easily overlooked amidst the passing plates and the distribution of cake slices. Miss Marple had observed a fleeting moment of hesitation. Mrs. Bantry, reaching for a slice, had paused, and in that brief interlude, her plate had been claimed by Mrs. Hartnell instead. A trivial occurrence, one might assume a mere polite mix-up at a bustling table. Yet Miss Marple's mind had catalogued it with the meticulousness of a housekeeper counting spoons. Now, in light of her newfound knowledge that the poison had been cleverly concealed within the cake, that hesitation took on a more sinister significance. The poisoned slice appeared to have been intended for another, and Mrs. Hartel had, by sheer chance, become the unwitting victim. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly, though her thoughts grew sharper. In her experience, murder was seldom a matter of coincidence. When plates were swapped, there was invariably a story lurking beneath the surface. The hand that reached first found no satisfaction in the discovery, only a deepening sense of unease. Somewhere in the village, the intended victim still walked free, and the real story had only just begun to emerge. Back in her parlor that evening, with her knitting beside her and the village quiet at last, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to consider. This was not a random act of malice. This was personal. The precision of the poison's placement, the careful folding into the cake itself, spoke of intent, yes, but also of knowledge. An understanding that extended beyond mere baking to encompass the dynamics of those who would gather around the table, the lingering tensions that lay just beneath the surface. She recalled the whispers collected during her visits, the age-old disputes over inheritance, the faded romances, the shameful events long buried, yet never entirely erased from memory. Everything was intertwined. It had to be. Miss Merrill had frequently observed that in small villages, crimes seldom pertained solely to the present. They were often the culmination of past transgressions resurfacing. Secrets that stubbornly lingered, the cake, the poison, the uncertainty at the table, it was all woven into a narrative that had started long before the garden gathering. And if there was one truth Miss Merrill held firmly, it was that human nature was immutable. Individuals might change their looks, their situations, even their identities, but their flaws, their envies, their anxieties stayed as constant as a recipe etched in ink. Miss Merrill resumed her knitting, her fingers moving with serene determination. Somewhere in the past lay. The key to the present lay before her, and all she needed to do now was follow the thread. Here is the complete AI voiceover-ready script for Chapter 5, Secrets from the Pantry, crafted seamlessly from the provided subheadings while preserving the refined, psychologically immersive tone characteristic of a classic mystery. It began, as many tales do, in St. Mary Me, with a missing recipe. Mrs. Lathbury, still flustered from the disastrous turn of the garden party, had misplaced her handwritten collection of baking notes, a collection she guarded with near reverence. Religious devotion led Miss Marple to visit, ostensibly to share some of Quint's jelly. However, she quickly became involved in the search, as Mrs. Lathbury insisted it had been misplaced in the pantry. In that small, shadowy corner, where old jars, forgotten tins, and the dust of several summers accumulated, Miss Marple's fingers eventually encountered something unexpected. Nestled between a recipe for gooseberry chutney and a leaflet on preserving lemons was a bundle of letters, neatly tied together. Faded blue ribbon edges brittle with age. "Oh," said Mrs. Lathbury, her voice a touch too bright. "Those, oh, I'd quite forgotten about those." Miss Merrill, who had never once forgotten anything, said nothing at all. But as the letters rested in her hands, she could almost feel the weight of them, not merely paper and ink, but something heavier, something that had waited quietly for far too long. That evening, with the letters unfolded upon her lap, Miss Merrill allowed herself the luxury of reading slowly. The handwriting was delicate, almost hesitant. The words held a peculiar intimacy, revealing a narrative never intended for public eyes. They unfolded a tale all too familiar in villages like St. Mary, a contested inheritance, a secret romance, and a betrayal so subtle it barely disturbed the air, yet left wounds deep enough to fester for decades. A young woman, promised one future, found herself denied both love and legacy when a sudden change of will favored another. Hearts shattered, reputations quietly tarnished, and what could have blossomed into a life of contentment curdled into something far less, something far sharper. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the final letter, her mind tracing the bitter lineage of that particular quarrel. Such things never truly die in a village. They simply sink beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment or the wrong person to stir them up again. The recipe book, when it was finally found, had been tucked inside an old biscuit tin, as though Mrs. Lathbury herself had wanted to forget it, yet couldn't quite bring herself to let it go. Miss Marple, ever practical, flipped through the pages with gentle curiosity. Most recipes were just as one would anticipate: Victoria sponge, fruit scones, seed cake. Yet, at the very bottom of the page for plum cake, Something piqued her interest, a note, pinned in a more assertive hand than Mrs. Lore's typical script. It was a reminder regarding the timing of the final stir, an adjustment that altered the consistency just enough to mask an added ingredient. It dawned on Miss Marple that this was not merely a baker's trick, but a display of a chemist's precision, the kind of modification known only to someone possessing both culinary expertise and scientific acumen. Knowledge enveloped her as she leaned back slightly, the familiar tingle of understanding settling at the base of her spine. This was no haphazard crime, no impulsive act born of sudden temper. It had been orchestrated with meticulous care, with insight, and most importantly, with intent. As the clock ticked softly in the corner, Miss Marple sat very still, reviewing her mental list of possible hands that could have introduced poison into the batter with such confidence. There were those who might have wished for Mrs. Hartel's departure, but not with this level of planning. Then there were those who could create exquisite pastries, yet remained oblivious to the intricacies of toxins. And then there was that strange convergence of someone possessing both intellect and talent. She reflected once more on the letters, the shattered promises, and the dreams that lay silently entombed. Someone had devoted years to mending old scars, biding their time for the ideal opportunity to balance the scales. When that moment finally arrived, they did not lean on fervor or rage, but rather on something far more perilous, a calm, calculated approach. Miss Marple set the recipe book aside, her fingers instinctively reaching for her knitting, though my thoughts drifted far from the present, to a place where someone in St. Mary Me had been waiting an eternity for either justice or revenge. The unfortunate reality was that a grave error had been made. They had taken the life of the wrong individual. Indeed, here lies the complete script for the AI voiceover of Chapter 6, A Villager's Tale, crafted seamlessly from the provided subheadings while preserving the elegant, psychologically rich style reminiscent of a classic mystery. In St. Mary Me, few could boast perfect recall of the village's transgressions, but Mrs. Phelps came remarkably close, settled comfortably in her front parlor. Encircled by the cherished volumes of her late husband and her remarkable recollections, Mrs. Phelps held the esteemed role of the village's unofficial historian, a distinction she embraced with both pride and a hint of self-importance. Miss Mar's visit, initially intended as a simple social engagement, was met with the expected joy. A visitor signified tea and conversation, both of which Mrs. Phelps relished. She poured generously from a slightly chipped teapot, while Miss Mar's gentle dialogue seamlessly transitioned to the recent Garden Society tea and its regrettable outcome, leaving Mrs. Phelps wide-eyed in shock. Gleaming with a peculiar brightness reserved for those who revel in shocking events just a tad too much. Mind you, St. Mary Me has witnessed worse. Do you recall old Mrs. Faraz? And of course, there was that dreadful affair with the vicar's second cousin, Miss Marple, who remembered everything. She smiled faintly and remarked, "It does seem rather like a pattern, doesn't it, when the past refuses to remain in its rightful place?" Mrs. Phelps sighed in agreement, her mind already reaching for a tale to weave. It all started, Mrs. Phelps began, an unfortunate engagement, a scandal that stirred the air at the time. Everyone believed Edith, now Mrs. Lathbury, would wed George Godfrey, but then, quite unexpectedly, it all unraveled. Miss Marple listened, her hands resting lightly on her lap. It was a story recounted often enough to be polished smooth, yet the underlying bitterness still peeked through the edges. Some say it was money, Mrs. Phelps continued, her voice lowering slightly. There was a legacy left by Edith's aunt, a considerable sum, but a dispute arose over who was entitled to it. The entire affair devolved into a rather distasteful dispute, and poor George, alas, departed in shame following some unfortunate allegations regarding missing funds. Miss Marple tilted her head, neither affirming nor denying the claims. What captivated her was not the scandal itself, such events were commonplace in villages, but rather the manner in which Mrs. Phelps recounted it, suggesting an air of unfinished business, a lingering sense of something unresolved beneath the familiar veneer of gossip. And Mrs. Hartel, Miss Marple inquired softly, was she implicated in any way? Oh, merely peripherally, said Mrs. Phelps. She was there, of course, always in the middle of things, but it was Edith who really had the grievance to bear. It was as Mrs. Phelps was refilling Miss Mel's cup that the slip occurred. A younger villager, Peggy Holmes, who had called in to return a borrowed embroidery pattern, stood listening, her own curiosity getting the better of her. "It's terrible," said Peggy wide-eyed. "Poison, of all things, in a plum cake." Mrs. Phelps tooted. "Such a way to go? But you know they say cyanide tastes faintly of almonds." "Not if you use the powdered form," Peggy said brightly. "Then it's almost completely invisible if you mix it into the sugar properly." There was a pause, a brief, awkward silence that passed so quickly it might have been missed entirely. Mrs. Phelps, slightly startled, asked how Peggy could possibly know such a thing. "Oh, I read it somewhere," Peggy said with a quick laugh, but her cheeks colored slightly and her hands twisted the edge of her sleeve. Miss Merrill, who had said nothing at all, placed her teacup carefully on its saucer and filed. As the moment slipped away, the conversation shifted, and soon enough, Miss Marple was making her way home through lanes bathed in the afternoon sun. Yet, her mind was anything but idle. It wasn't merely Peggy's words that captured her interest, it was the manner in which they were delivered. The confidence, the casual ease with which she discussed a method not commonly known, even in the village gossip circles. The people Miss Marple encountered rarely stumbled upon knowledge of poisons by chance, and when they did, they seldom spoke of it so openly unless the knowledge had been recently acquired or recently used. More importantly, there had been no public confirmation about the exact poison or how it had been administered. That detail about mixing it into the sugar had not been printed in any paper, which meant Peggy knew something she shouldn't. But Miss Mel said none of this was allowed. Instead, she walked steadily back to her cottage, her face as mild as the day itself. After all, she was an old lady, and old ladies are not supposed to notice things. But Miss Merrill had always noticed things, and today, she had noticed something truly significant. Here is the complete AI voiceover-ready script for Chapter 7, The Vanished Recipe Book, crafted seamlessly from the provided subheadings. It maintains the elegant, psychologically layered, and suspenseful tone that is characteristic of a classic mystery. Miss Merrill had long held the belief that a tidy kitchen could be far more suspicious than a messy one. After all, in a household where baking was a regular occurrence and flour dust settled like gentle snow, a spotless counter and 2 neat shelves suggested anything but domestic tranquility. Efficiency, yet there was an air of something intentionally concealed. That thought crossed her mind when she summoned Mrs. Lathbury again, under the guise of needing a recipe for lemon-curd biscuits. Miss Merrill found herself in the kitchen, where not a single crumb disrupted the pristine surface. However, the recipe book, the very one used for the now infamous plum cake, was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Lathbury, bustling about with tea things, dismissed the matter with a vague wave of her hand. "It'll turn up, I expect. I must have left it somewhere silly," she said, though a strain was evident in her voice. Her voice carried a subtle weight, and a fleeting glance was cast toward the vacant space on the shelf where the book ought to have resided. Miss Marple merely smiled, as if it were of no consequence, and made a courteous remark about how simple it was to misplace items when one's thoughts were preoccupied. Yet, within her mind, it was evident that the book had been taken, not lost. Later, over tea at Mrs. Bantry's, Miss Marple deftly guided the conversation toward baking traditions, a topic sure to unleash a torrent of memories in any village gathering. Before long, Mrs. Bantry was reminiscing plum cake recipes from her grandmother's time, while Mrs. Price Ridley added her own thoughts on the significance of the final stir. "Mrs. Laborie always relies on her aunt's old recipe," said Mrs. Bantry with assurance. "I recall it specifically because it requires warming the brandy, first, an unusual method, but she swears by it." It was a small detail, yet one that Miss Merrill tucked away in her mind. Back home, she pieced together the recipe from memory, each step meticulously noted on a sheet of paper, as if unraveling a culinary mystery. And there, in the very last step, was where the distinction lay in the original recipe, which instructed to fold in the fruit at the end, while the version presented at the garden party had integrated the fruit much earlier, alongside the sugar. That subtle alteration, Miss Merrill realized, could only have been executed by someone intent on concealing something within the mixture, something that would dissolve imperceptibly into the sugar's granules. It was no ordinary cake. After all, it served as a delivery system. The vanished recipe book resurfaced, as such things often do, in the most inconvenient location, at the bottom of a box of old items. Papers belonging to Mrs. Laurie's late aunt had been tucked there as though someone hoped they might quietly vanish with time. Among the pages, between a recipe for soat pudding and a leaflet on stain removal, lay something altogether unexpected, a birth certificate. Its edges were yellowed with age, its ink slightly faded, but its significance was crystal clear. The child born out of wedlock had been acknowledged only in this single piece of paper. The father's name, a name well known in the village, had been hastily inscribed, crossed out yet still faintly legible. The mother's name belonged to the very woman whose plum cake had ignited a murder. Miss Marple sat with the paper in her hands for a long time, the weight of forgotten shame and quiet scandal seeping up from the fragile page. The birth certificate didn't merely reveal a child. It unveiled a claim, one that could unravel a carefully preserved inheritance and expose secrets that had lain uneasily for decades. Miss Marple had always understood that murder in a village was rarely about the. In the present moment, the tale unfolds, rooted in years gone by, within parlors and gardens, and in hushed exchanges behind lace curtains. This was not a crime ignited by a fleeting rage. Rather, it stemmed from a profound, lingering fear, the sort that thrives when the past clings stubbornly to life. Someone had unearthed the truth about that child, perhaps through idle gossip or mere chance, or even through spite. In a village where lineage held sacred significance, a secret child with a legitimate claim became a weapon poised for use, like poison meticulously concealed within a cake. It appeared to be the ideal resolution, a neat conclusion to a tangled secret, yet the wrong individual had made the fateful cut, and now the entire decaying narrative loomed large. Miss Marple placed the birth certificate aside and picked up her knitting. Her fingers worked automatically while her thoughts wandered, sifting through names, motives, and the delicate balance between familial pride and downfall. She believed it was nearly finished, but not entirely, for the most perilous individuals were not those with something to gain, but rather those with everything at stake. The invitation, pinned in Miss Mel's tidy, slanted script, was utterly unremarkable, just a simple tea. She had kept it informal, a friendly gathering intended to dispel the gloom that had settled over the village following the unfortunate events at the Garden Society. No one could possibly decline. After all, when Miss Marple invited you for tea, you accepted. It was a matter of village etiquette, as firmly established as attending church fete or judging the Christmas cake competition. They arrived promptly. Mrs. Lathbury, Mrs. Bantry, Peggy Holmes, and even Mr. Godfrey, who had been making a concerted effort to blend into the background since his return, found himself settling into his chair alongside the others. They accepted tea and currant buns, exchanging courteous remarks about the weather, though each of them was acutely aware of the true purpose of their gathering. Miss Marple sat at the head of the table, her knitting resting beside her. Her smile remained as gentle and unassuming as ever. She inquired about rheumatism, asked after chrysanthemums, and mentioned a recipe for ginger cake she had discovered tucked away in an old magazine. The conversation flowed aimlessly as village conversations flowed gently, yet beneath the surface, a current was at play. Miss Marple was guiding them softly and steadily toward her intended destination. "It's funny," she remarked, her tone light and almost casual. "People think plum cake is the same everywhere, but it isn't, is it? Some warm the brandy first, while others fold the fruit in at the very end." Mrs. Lathbury offered a distracted nod, her fingers twitching slightly against her teacup. "I always do the fruit first," she replied quickly, "but everyone has their ways." Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Turning to Mrs. Bantry, "Your mother often remarked that the key to a perfect sponge was all in the folding, never too much, never too little." "Oh, she was quite passionate about it," Mrs. Bantry chuckled, recalling how a heavy hand could spoil a cake quicker than pour flour. The discussion meandered. Cakes led to cookbooks, which seamlessly transitioned into family recipes and those that evolved over time. Miss Marple's inquiries were never straightforward, merely soft nudges, each one gently stirring the surface, revealing what was hidden beneath. No one observed the pattern, yet felt the absence of Marple herself. Each comment, each observation, drew the circle tighter. There was only one individual at the table who could not resist stepping into the trap, for only one held the crucial detail. It was Peggy Holmes who faltered, her eagerness to assist betraying her. Miss Marple noted how Peggy leaned in, a bright smile plastered on her face. "Oh no," she exclaimed. "You wouldn't fold the fruit in at the end for a plum cake. That's for a seed cake. For a plum cake, you mix the fruit with the sugar first, sow it evenly." There was a silence, not long, not dramatic, but to Miss Marple it rang as clearly as a church bell on a frosty morning. No one else noticed. No one, except Miss Merrill, knew the true significance of what Peggy had just said, because that exact method, folding the fruit with the sugar, was the very step that had allowed the cyanide to be hidden in the cake, and that step had never been mentioned in any of the gossip, nor in any of the papers. Only the poisoner could possibly have known it. Miss Merrill smiled, gently offering Peggy another slice of cake, and the conversation drifted away. But for Miss Marple, the case was already closed. Long after the guests had departed, leaving only crumbs and polite farewells, she sat by her window, her knitting resting in her lap. Outside, the village settled into its familiar evening hush, the sound of a gate closing, the distant hum of a wireless, the soft clink of a teacup being washed. She had not accused Peggy Holmes outright. That was not her way. Accusations belonged to the policeman, not to her. Preferred was something far subtler, a gentle nudge, a soft correction, air quietly held up until the guilty party saw themselves reflected back. Peggy had seen herself that afternoon, though she likely didn't know it yet, but the truth was there now, woven into the polite fabric of village life, where nothing was ever forgotten for long. Miss Merrill picked up her knitting again, her hands moving with the same quiet precision with which she had solved the whole unpleasant business. Justice in her experience was rarely about dramatic confrontations. It was about perceiving the intricate design hidden beneath the surface, the thread that had been dropped long ago, connecting the past to the present. Now that the pattern was complete, all that was left was to refine the edges with the same care one would take when folding in the fruit at the end of a perfect cake. The room was hushed, the teacups long emptied. When Miss Merrill began to speak, her voice was soft, almost casual, as if she were merely discussing a misplaced knitting pattern. Yet what followed was the delicate unraveling of a. With each revelation, the narrative unfolded, revealing that the cake was never meant for Mrs. Harrell. Instead, it was destined for another, someone entwined with a perilous piece of history. Her voice held no drama, no accusations, just the calm assurance of a keen observer of humanity. Miss Merrill clarified that the true target was Mrs. Lathbury, not out of malice, but due to the secrets concealed within her ancient recipe book. A soft ripple of intrigue spread through the room. Table as Miss Merrill recounted the seemingly innocent plate swap, a fleeting trivial moment when Mrs. Hartnell had inadvertently reached for the wrong slice of cake, altering the entire course of events. It was, if anything, a mistake born of politeness, Miss Merrill noted softly. Yet, murder shows no mercy for such nuances, and thus, the wrong person met their end. Her fingers danced lightly over her knitting, her voice barely above a whisper. The truth, after all, required no embellishment. The poisoner's scheme had been straightforward in its own way. Mrs. Lathbury, keeper of the recipe book and all its secrets. Hidden secrets were the intended target. Her death was meant to silence a past indiscretion before it could unravel a present fortune. But fate and a passing plate intervened. Mrs. Hartnell, gossipy and sharp-tongued, took the fatal blow instead. With that, the crime morphed from a cold and calculated act into something far messier, far more tragic. "It is one thing," Miss Merle said softly, "to plan the death of an enemy you've hated for years. It is quite another to find you've killed the wrong person entirely, someone who, for all her faults, had done you no harm at all." There was no satisfaction in Miss Mel's voice, no triumphant gleam of the clever sleuth, only the quiet sadness of a woman who had witnessed this same story unfold in countless variations. Hatred curdling into vengeance, vengeance unraveling into tragedy, until all that remained was regret. Human nature, Miss Mel reflected, though no one else heard it, never changes. It had all begun, as so many village tragedies do, with a secret poorly kept, a birth hidden out of shame, an inheritance disputed in whispers. Romance shattered not by absence of love, but by the subtle brutality of wealth and arrogance. Over time, the tale had submerged, cloaked by fresh rumors, new conflicts, and elegant gatherings. Yet, the past, as Miss Marple knew, never truly fades, it merely lingers. When someone probes deep enough, the discoveries are seldom beautiful. The letters, the modified recipe, the ancient birth certificate, all tarnished by time and silence, each element, like components in a ghastly concoction, converge to yield murder, not the handiwork of a criminal mastermind, but of a frightened one, someone who feared the truth more than they feared a noose in a village. Miss Marple said, her voice a shade softer, "The past is never very far away. It lingers in cupboards, in parlors, in the way old friends do not meet one another's eyes." She had seen it all before, and she would no doubt see it again. When the final guest had gone and the door closed softly behind them, Miss Marple took a moment to tidy the tea things, her hands steady and practiced, rinsing cups and folding cloth napkins with the same quiet efficiency. She had unraveled the entire affair, and as the evening air turned cool, the light gently faded across the village. Curtains were drawn, radios clicked on, and the rhythm of ordinary life resumed. Miss Marple stepped into her small garden, hands folded lightly before her. The world appeared so peaceful, so utterly ordinary, yet only hours before, that same peace had concealed a murder born of ancient bitterness. As she walked along the path, her thoughts wandered not to guilt or justice, but to the unchanging nature of people. They baked cakes, they planted roses, they attended gatherings, and yet beneath the surface, the same old emotions bubbled and festered. Envy, resentment, pride, fear. The recipes never changed. Miss Marple smiled faintly, though it was a smile touched with melancholy. In St. Mary Me, the past was always at the table, whether you invited it or not. And though Miss Marple knew the case was closed, she also understood that the village would forget none of it, for in places like St. Mary Me, the greatest crime of all was forgetting. With her, Shaw pulled a little. Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage, leaving the village to its whispers and memories. Another secret slips beneath the surface in St. Mary Me, a village that appears so peaceful from the outside. Yet, behind every hedge and under every tea table, human nature quietly does its work. Jealousies simmer, old wounds never quite heal, and the past, no matter how carefully buried, always finds its way back to the surface. This tale serves as a reminder of something Miss Marple has always understood. The smallest actions can have profound consequences. An exchanged dish, a modified recipe, a note concealed in a pantry can resonate through time in the most surprising manners. Beneath the courteous smiles and light-hearted chatter lies a web of past resentments, hushed anxieties, and truths that stubbornly remain hidden. But here's the pivotal question, one that only you can ponder. If you resided in a village like St. Mary Me, where every soul is aware of everyone else's truths, would you place your trust in your neighbors, or would you safeguard your own secrets for eternity? I'm eager to hear your reflections in the comments. What are your thoughts on this? Today's enigma. Did you have an inkling of who the poisoner might be, or did the revelation catch you off guard? If you found yourself in a village brimming with secrets, how would you navigate such a world? Let's delve into that mystery together in the comments below. If this tale captivated you, don't forget to subscribe for more intriguing stories like this one, where every cup of tea conceals a secret and every hushed conversation could crack the case. And if you know someone who adores a classic twist, share this video with them. After all, unraveling a good mystery is always more enjoyable when done in good company.